I've spent decades peering into the hidden chambers of the human mind, and I discovered something that still unsettles me. Approximately 3% of people possess a psychological architecture so unusual that they experience reality fundamentally differently than everyone around them. These individuals don't fit. They never have. And for years, I believed this was their curse. I was catastrophically wrong. What I mistook for pathology was actually a dormant capability, one that, when awakened, grants access to a form of personal power most people will never touch. If you've always felt like an exile in your own life, this test will reveal why, and more importantly, what comes next. Let me take you somewhere I rarely speak about, into the actual moment when I first glimpsed this pattern. Not in my consulting room, but in my own life. I was sitting in my study late one evening, surrounded by case files that had accumulated over months of practice. The lamp cast shadows across pages filled with my observations, my diagnostic notes, my careful analyses. I was troubled, deeply troubled, because I kept seeing the same pattern emerging across seemingly unrelated patients, and my existing framework couldn't explain it. I had a recurring patient, let's call her Helena, who arrived in profound distress. She was accomplished, articulate, objectively successful in her professional life, yet she came to me reporting something that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with her external circumstances. She felt, in her words, like she existed behind glass, watching life happen to people who seemed to possess an instruction manual she'd never received. Every social interaction required translation. Every relationship eventually revealed the same pattern. People were initially fascinated by her depth, then gradually exhausted by it. She'd learned to perform lightness, to mirror the ease others seemed to carry naturally. But it was killing something essential inside her. She could feel herself disappearing beneath the performance, and she didn't know how to stop without losing everyone. During one session, Helena described a recurring dream that had plagued her since childhood. She was in a vast museum, walking through galleries filled with paintings. But these weren't ordinary paintings. Every canvas she approached would begin moving the moment she stood before it. The painted figures would turn toward her, hidden symbols would illuminate, entire narratives would unfold that transformed the apparent subject matter into something infinitely more complex and meaningful. She'd see connections between paintings in different rooms, patterns that linked disparate works into a coherent whole. The museum, she realized in the dream, was speaking to her in a language she understood fluently. But here's where the dream became a nightmare. She'd try to share these revelations with the other museum visitors. She'd turn to the person beside her, urgency rising in her chest, desperate to show them what she was seeing. And every time, without exception, she'd discover her mouth had been sewn shut with thick black thread. She couldn't make a sound. The other visitors would notice her distress, offer polite smiles of concern, then gradually drift away to other galleries. They'd move on, unchanged and untroubled, while she remained trapped in silence with all this meaning she couldn't communicate. She'd wake from this dream with her jaw clenched so tightly it would ache for hours. The feeling that stayed with her throughout the day wasn't fear exactly. It was something more devastating. The certainty that she was perceiving something real that no one else could validate. That her depth of perception isolated her rather than connected her. That the more clearly she saw, the more alone she became. I made a terrible mistake initially. I interpreted this dream through the lens I'd been trained to use. I saw it as anxiety about authentic expression, about childhood wounds that had taught her to silence herself, about social fears that needed to be overcome through exposure and courage. I encouraged her to speak her truth more boldly, to stop hiding her insights, to trust that the right people would appreciate her depth. I gave her what I thought was empowering advice. Be yourself, share openly, the people who matter will rise to meet you. She tried. God help me. She tried with everything she had. She stopped performing lightness in her relationships. She shared her observations, her complex interpretations of conversations and situations, her philosophical questions about ordinary moments. She stopped translating herself into simpler language. She stopped pretending that small talk satisfied her. She stopped nodding along when discussions remained stubbornly surface level. And she lost relationships, one after another. Not dramatically, there were no explosive conflicts or accusations, just a gradual cooling. Invitations that stopped coming. Conversations that grew more strained and less frequent. Friends who suddenly had less time, who seemed relieved when she was too busy to meet. A romantic partner who told her, with evident regret, that being with her felt like constant work, like he was always failing some test he couldn't see. Her workplace relationships became awkward. Colleagues started describing her as intense, as someone who made simple things complicated, as exhausting. She returned to me 6 months later, not in distress this time, but in pieces, completely fragmented. She sat in the chair across from me and said something I'll never forget. "You told me to be myself." I tried, and myself, apparently, is someone no one can tolerate for long. So what now? Do I go back to performing, knowing it's killing me? Or do I keep being authentic, knowing it means being alone? I had no answer that day. I sent her home with platitudes about finding her tribe, about the right people being out there. But, sitting alone in my study that night, her question haunted me, because I'd seen this pattern before. Not just with Helena, but with a small subset of patients who shared certain characteristics. They processed emotional information with unusual speed and complexity. They noticed patterns others missed. They experienced ordinary interactions as laden with subtext and meaning. They needed depth the way most people need air, and they were suffering immensely, not from clear pathology I could diagnose and treat, but from something I couldn't name. That's when I realized my catastrophic error. I'd been treating the symptom while completely misunderstanding the structure. Helena didn't need to learn to speak louder or more boldly. She didn't need courage or exposure therapy or validation techniques. She needed to understand that she was operating with a fundamentally different perceptual apparatus than most people around her, one that processed emotional and symbolic information most people's minds automatically filtered out as noise. Think about that for a moment. Most human beings have psychological mechanisms that screen out the majority of ambient emotional data, subtle relational dynamics, symbolic meanings embedded in casual interactions. These filters aren't deficiencies, they're adaptive. They allow people to function in complex social environments without becoming overwhelmed. They make it possible to have light, pleasant interactions without drowning in subtext. They enable people to take things at face value and move on. Helena didn't have these filters. Or more accurately, her filters were so permeable they barely functioned. She absorbed everything. Every micro-expression, every tonal shift, every unspoken tension in a room, every symbolic resonance in a casual story someone told. Her mind processed all of this automatically, involuntarily, constantly. She wasn't choosing to see deeper meanings. She literally couldn't not see them. Think of it this way. When most people look at a house, they see a house. When an architect looks at a house, they see load-bearing walls, foundation integrity, structural compromises. They can't turn it off. It's not a party trick. It's how their brain has been trained to process reality. Emma's brain worked the same way with human behavior. A colleague mentions they're fine while their jaw clenches involuntarily. A friend laughs too loudly at a joke that isn't funny. A family member changes the subject whenever certain topics arise. For most people, these are just moments, interactions. For Emma, they were flashing neon signs pointing to underground caverns of meaning. And here's what made her situation particularly exhausting. She didn't just notice these patterns in others. She noticed them in herself. Constantly, relentlessly. She'd catch herself avoiding eye contact and immediately wonder what she was hiding from. She'd notice herself using humor to deflect and think, there it is, the defense mechanism, right on schedule. She'd observe her own resistance to vulnerability and mentally catalogue it as a pattern that probably originated in childhood. This is what I call the curse of psychological awareness. The more you understand about the machinery of the mind, the harder it becomes to simply times live times without constantly analysing the machinery. Imagine trying to enjoy a movie while simultaneously deconstructing every camera angle, lighting choice, and editing decision. That's what Emma's life felt like. The performance and the analysis happening simultaneously, neither one ever getting her full attention. Her friends would say things like, "You think too much, just be present," as if she hadn't tried that, as if she could simply decide to stop her brain from doing what it had been trained over decades to do automatically. Because here's what people don't understand about hyper-awareness. It's not a switch you flip on when it's useful and off when it's not. It's the constant hum of a machine that never powers down. It runs while you're having coffee, while you're trying to sleep, while you're attempting to have a normal conversation without cataloguing every micro-expression and linguistic pattern. Emma had tried everything to quiet it. Meditation, which just gave her more time to notice her thoughts. Distraction, which worked temporarily until her brain found patterns in the distraction itself. Even therapy, which sometimes felt like two hyper-aware people sitting across from each other, both noticing everything, both knowing the other was noticing, locked in an infinite loop of mutual observation. The social cost was significant. Relationships became complicated when you could see exactly how they were breaking down before the other person even realized anything was wrong. You'd notice the slight decrease in text frequency, the microsecond delay before they smiled, the way their enthusiasm had become performative. And you'd know, weeks before the inevitable conversation, exactly where things were headed. You couldn't unknow what you knew. You couldn't unsee what you'd seen. Emma once told me she felt like she was living in a world where everyone else was watching the movie, and she was the only one who could see the strings holding up the puppets. Not because she was smarter, not because she was special, simply because her attention had been trained through years of psychological study and personal excavation to notice what most people's brains were designed to filter out. And the exhausting part? The truly draining aspect? She still had to participate. She still had to show up to social events where people performed their well-adjusted personas. She still had to pretend she didn't notice the desperate performance of it all. She still had to smile and nod when someone said they were doing great, while everything about their body language screamed the opposite. She realized that awakening doesn't place you above the human condition. It places you more deeply within it. But now you see the machinery, while everyone else mistakes it for reality. You become fluent in a language no one else is speaking. You understand the subtext beneath every conversation, the hidden desperation behind every perfectly curated Instagram post, the terror driving every casual mention of accomplishments. And here's what makes it unbearable at first. You can't unhear it. You can't unsee it. It's like suddenly being able to hear every dog whistle in human interaction. The need for validation, the fear of insignificance, the performance of confidence masking bone-deep uncertainty. Every conversation becomes layered with meaning that most participants aren't consciously aware of. You watch someone humble brag about how busy they are, and you don't just hear the words, you hear the desperate assertion of worth. You hear someone say they don't care what others think, and you see with perfect clarity how much they care, how the very statement is itself a plea for approval of their supposed independence. You witness someone criticizing another person, and you recognize it immediately for what it is, a projection, an externalization of something they cannot face in themselves. This woman learned to navigate what I call the double awareness. She lived in two worlds simultaneously. The surface world where people said things and meant something entirely different, and the depth world where the real communication was happening through tone, through hesitation, through what was carefully not being said. She'd be at dinner with friends, and someone would announce they got a promotion. Everyone would congratulate them, and she would too. But she'd also notice the micro-expression of threat that flickered across another friend's face. She'd see how the conversation immediately turned to that person reasserting their own accomplishments. She'd watch the subtle competition unfold with everyone trying to establish their position in an invisible hierarchy. And she'd think, we're all just terrified animals, trying to prove we deserve to exist. The exhausting part wasn't the seeing. It was the participating. Because she still had to be part of these interactions, she still had to engage with the surface conversation while being fully aware of the underground river of need flowing beneath it. She had to respond to what people said while managing what they actually meant. She had to perform interest in status games she no longer believed in, while not making others feel judged for still playing them. She told me once, "It's like I'm watching a play where everyone's reading from a script they don't realize is a script. And I'm still on stage, still expected to deliver my lines, but I can see the audience, the lighting equipment, the director in the wings. I can't pretend it's real anymore, but I can't walk off stage either." This is the loneliness of awakening that no one prepares you for. You're surrounded by people, engaged in constant interaction, but you're fundamentally alone with your awareness. You see them suffering, see them trapped in patterns they can't recognize, and you cannot simply download your understanding into their consciousness. You cannot force someone to see what they're not ready to see. This is what I find most people misunderstand about psychoanalysis. They think it's about me telling them what's wrong. They come to my office expecting diagnosis, prescription, solution. They want me to be the mechanic who identifies the broken part and replaces it. But the human psyche doesn't work like a machine with interchangeable components. You cannot simply extract a neurosis like a rotten tooth. The work is about creating conditions for recognition. I can point, I can question, I can reflect back what I observe. But the actual seeing, that must happen within the patient themselves. And here's what makes it agonizing: they will fight this recognition with everything they have. The ego protects itself like a fortress protecting its treasure, even when that treasure is pain itself. I've watched patients spend years circling around a single truth. They'll tell me stories that clearly illustrate their pattern. They'll describe situation after situation where the same dynamic repeats, and when I gently suggest the connection, they'll look at me as if I've spoken in ancient Greek. No, you don't understand," they'll say. "This situation was completely different," and they genuinely believe it. The mind is a spectacular editor of its own narrative. This resistance isn't stupidity. It's not even lack of insight. Exactly. It's that recognition threatens the entire structure of how they've learned to survive. Imagine you've built your house on a particular piece of ground. You've invested everything in this location. Then someone suggests the ground itself is unstable. Your first response isn't gratitude, it's defense. This ground has held me my entire life. Who are you to question it? The same man who comes to me complaining of misery in his marriage will simultaneously defend every aspect of how he relates to his wife. He'll describe feeling controlled, suffocated, unable to be himself. Then he'll list all the ways she's unreasonable, demanding, impossible to satisfy. And if I ask about his role, how he might be participating in this dance, the resistance arrives immediately. "But you don't know her. You don't see what I deal with." He cannot yet see that he chose her, that something in him sought exactly this dynamic, that perhaps he needs to be controlled because responsibility for his own desires terrifies him more than resentment. that by making her the tyrant, he avoids facing his own fear of autonomy. This recognition would require him to give up his victim narrative, his sense of righteousness, his comfortable misery. And comfortable misery is often more tolerable than uncertain freedom. You see the pattern everywhere once you learn to look. The woman who complains her friends always betray her, yet she systematically chooses untrustworthy people. The man who says he wants success while sabotaging every opportunity. The parent who claims to want their child's happiness while crushing every expression of independence. They're not lying when they state their desires. They genuinely believe what they say, but their unconscious has a different agenda entirely, and it's far more powerful than their conscious intentions. This is why insight alone doesn't cure. You can understand your pattern intellectually and still repeat it compulsively. I've had patients who can articulate their dynamics beautifully, who understand the origins in their childhood, who recognize the pattern as it's happening, and who still cannot stop themselves. Because knowing is not the same as transforming. The unconscious doesn't speak the language of logic. It speaks through symptoms, through actions, through the very patterns we're trying to escape. This is why intellectualization becomes its own defense mechanism, the mind's way of maintaining distance from feelings that threaten to overwhelm us. I've watched countless individuals build elaborate theories about their suffering while remaining utterly untouched by emotional truth. Consider the man who comes to me with marital problems. He can tell you, with impressive precision, how his father's emotional unavailability created an attachment wound, how he projects his unmet needs onto his wife, how his anger is really fear of abandonment, and yet, when his wife expresses a need for emotional connection, he withdraws. When she asks for vulnerability, he criticizes. The insight changes nothing, because it hasn't reached the layer where the actual conflict lives. The transformation requires something far more difficult than understanding. It requires affect, the experiencing of emotions that were too dangerous to feel at their origin. The patient who intellectualizes his childhood neglect must actually grieve the father he needed and never had. The woman who understands her perfectionism must face the terror of being seen as inadequate. This is the work that frightens people away from analysis, because it demands we feel what we've spent our entire lives avoiding. I recall a particularly striking case, a professor of philosophy. Brilliant, capable of the most sophisticated abstractions about human nature. He sought my help for what he called an interesting puzzle. He could not maintain intimate relationships. Women left him, invariably, after several months. He wanted to understand the pattern, and understand it he did, with remarkable speed. Within weeks, he had mapped his entire psychological landscape. The mother who praised achievement but withdrew affection, the learned equation between worth and intellectual performance, the fear of being loved for himself rather than his accomplishments. Fascinating, he would say, as though discussing someone else entirely. The mechanism is quite clear now, yet nothing changed. He continued to lecture his partners, to correct their grammar during arguments, to retreat into abstractions whenever emotional demands arose. The pattern persisted because his understanding remained theoretical. He had analyzed himself without actually meeting himself, without experiencing the childhood wound of feeling fundamentally unlovable unless performing. The breakthrough came not through another interpretation, but through something unexpected. One session, I made an error. I confused a detail from his history, attributed something to his mother that was actually about his father. A small mistake, and he became furious. Not the controlled anger of intellectual disagreement, but rage. Wounded, betrayed rage. "You're not even listening to me," he shouted. "I'm just another case to you, another puzzle to solve." There it was, not the understanding of being unloved, but the feeling of it. In that moment, he wasn't analyzing the pattern he was experiencing the original injury, the child who needed to be seen and heard, not evaluated and assessed. And in that experience, something shifted. Because now the pattern had a feeling attached to it, an emotional reality that made it matter in a way intellectual knowledge never could. This is the threshold where so many people stop. They've had the insight, they've seen the pattern, they understand intellectually what's happening, and they think, aha! Now that I understand it, I'll simply stop doing it. But you don't understand it yet. Not really. Intellectual understanding is merely the anteroom to the palace of transformation. The real work, is making that journey from the head to the heart, and then from the heart into the body where the pattern actually lives. Because these patterns aren't stored as ideas, they're stored as sensations, as muscular tensions, as habitual ways your nervous system responds before you even become conscious of responding. Think of it this way. A man comes to see me complaining that he cannot sleep. He lies awake night after night, his mind racing with worries about his business, his health, his children's future. He has read books about sleep hygiene. He has tried warm milk and meditation apps and keeping his bedroom dark and cool. Nothing works. And he becomes frustrated because he understands that worry doesn't solve anything, that his obsessive thinking is counterproductive. But still, every night the pattern repeats. We begin to explore, and slowly, through our work together, he begins to notice something. The worrying always begins with a particular physical sensation, a slight constriction in his chest, a subtle quickening of his heartbeat. His mind immediately interprets this sensation as evidence that something is wrong, that danger is approaching, that he must figure something out right now. But here's what's fascinating. That physical sensation isn't responding to present-day reality. It's a bodily memory, triggered perhaps by the simple act of lying down in darkness, of being alone and unoccupied. And for this man, as we discover, being alone and unoccupied as a child meant being vulnerable, because that's when his father would appear unpredictably, either to rage or to withdraw into cold silence. The child learned to stay vigilant, to keep his mind working, analyzing, preparing. If he could just figure out what mood his father was in, what might trigger an outburst, he might stay safe. The racing thoughts were his childhood survival strategy. And 40 years later, his body still thinks it's in that childhood bedroom, waiting for his father's footsteps in the hall. Now comes the crucial part. This man can understand this story intellectually. He can nod and say, yes, I see the connection. But that won't change the pattern, because the pattern doesn't live in his understanding. It lives in that chest constriction, in that accelerated heartbeat, in the automatic cascade of worry that follows. The transformation requires something different. It requires him to stay present with that physical sensation when it arises, to resist the immediate pull toward worrying and fixing, and to simply feel what's there, to feel the tightness, the slight panic, the impulse to protect himself, and in feeling it fully, with awareness, without judgment, something remarkable happens. The sensation begins to shift. Because now, for the first time, there's consciousness present with the experience. The adult part of him can witness the child part of him, can say, I see you're frightened. I understand why you learned to stay vigilant. But you're safe now. You don't have to keep watch anymore. This isn't positive thinking. This isn't affirmations or self-talk. This is something much deeper. It's the integration of a split-off part of the self, the part that was overwhelmed and alone, now finally being met with awareness and compassion. And gradually, over time, the body begins to release its grip. The nervous system learns that it's safe to relax, that being alone in the dark doesn't require constant surveillance. The pattern doesn't vanish overnight, but it loosens. It becomes less automatic, less compelling. And here is where I observe something fascinating in my practice. When the pattern loosens, when that compulsion to check and recheck finally begins to fade, many patients expect to feel relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. But instead, what often emerges first is a peculiar sense of loss. One patient described it as mourning. "I know it was exhausting," she told me. "I know it kept me up for hours, but it was also mine. It was how I showed myself that I cared, that I was being responsible." This is not madness. This is the strange attachment we form to our suffering when it has served us, when it has been our companion through dark nights. The ritual became part of her identity. Without it, she felt unmoored, as if she'd lost a part of herself. And in a sense, she had. She'd lost the version of herself who needed that particular form of protection. This is why simply telling someone with OCD to just stop is not merely ineffective, it's cruel. You're asking them to abandon a strategy that, however maladaptive, has kept them feeling safe. You're asking them to jump without showing them there's ground to land on. The therapeutic work isn't about ripping away the compulsion. It's about building something new in its place. A different relationship to uncertainty. A different way of managing anxiety. Consider what happens in the brain during this process. The circuits that fire together, wire together. This is the principle of neuroplasticity. Every time the patient performed the checking ritual, they strengthened the neural pathway connecting the intrusive thought to the compulsive behavior. The pathway became a highway, automatic and smooth. But the brain is remarkably adaptive. When we consistently choose a different response, when we sit with the anxiety without performing the ritual, we begin carving out a new pathway. At first, this new pathway is barely a footpath through dense forest. It's uncomfortable. It requires tremendous effort and conscious intention. The old highway is still there, smooth and inviting, calling the patient back to familiar territory. But with each repetition of the new behavior, the footpath widens. It becomes easier to travel, and slowly, gradually, the old highway begins to fade, overgrown with disuse. This is not poetry. This is measurable, observable change in brain structure. Brain imaging studies show that successful treatment of OCD actually alters activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, the region involved in error detection and worry. The brain physically reorganizes itself around the new pattern of response. But here's what the neuroscience cannot fully capture: the moment when a patient realizes they've forgotten to perform their ritual. Not because they white-knuckled through the urge, but because the urge simply didn't come. They went to bed without checking the locks and only remembered the next morning. And instead of panic, they felt nothing. Neutrality. The blessed ordinariness of a mind that has moved on to other concerns. These moments are profound. They are evidence that the self is not fixed, that we are not condemned to endless repetition of our patterns. They prove that transformation is possible, not through force or willpower alone, but through patient, persistent engagement with the mechanisms that drive us. Yet, I must also speak honestly about the limitations. Not every pattern yields so readily. Some forms of suffering are more entrenched, more complex in their origins. There are patients I have encountered whose symptoms are so interwoven with their very sense of self that to remove them would be to demolish the entire architecture of their identity. A woman who has organized her entire life around her invalidism, who has secured through her suffering a position of unassailable centrality in her family, what becomes of her if we take away the symptom that has given her life meaning and structure? She may consciously desire relief, yet unconsciously she clings to her affliction as a drowning person clings to a piece of wreckage. And then there are the constitutional factors we cannot ignore. Some individuals possess a nervous disposition so fragile, so reactive to the slightest disturbance, that the work of analysis becomes like trying to build a stable structure on shifting sand. The biological substrate matters. We are not merely minds floating free of our bodies, we are embodied creatures, and the chemistry of our nervous system sets boundaries to what psychological intervention alone can achieve. I have also learned through bitter experience that the analyst himself introduces variables we cannot fully control. My own unconscious, my own unresolved conflicts, what I have come to call the counter-transference. These inevitably color the therapeutic relationship. There have been cases where I failed, not because the method was insufficient, but because something in the patient awakened in me responses I had not adequately examined in myself. The analyst must undergo his own analysis, must know his own depths, yet even this is no guarantee of perfect neutrality. And let us speak plainly about a limitation that troubles me deeply, the question of accessibility. This treatment requires resources, time, money, a certain level of education and psychological sophistication. The working man who labors 10 hours daily to feed his family, who returns home exhausted to a cramped apartment filled with crying children, how can such a person afford the luxury of multiple sessions per week, the leisure to explore the depths of his psyche? There is something troublingly aristocratic about psychoanalysis as I have developed it. It serves best those who already possess certain advantages. This inequality weighs on my conscience. The suffering of the poor is no less real than that of the bourgeoisie, yet our method remains largely inaccessible to them. I have dreamed of free clinics, of ways to adapt the treatment for shorter durations, but the essential nature of the work resists such compressions. One cannot hurry the unconscious. One cannot schedule revelation for the convenience of economic necessity. There is also the limitation of cultural specificity. My theories emerged from my observations of late 19th century Viennese society, a particular culture at a particular moment in history. When I speak of the Oedipus complex, am I describing a universal structure of human development, or am I universalizing what may be specific to European family configurations? This question haunts me. The indigenous tribes that Malinowski describes, with their entirely different family structures, do they experience the same psychological dynamics? I want to believe I have discovered universal truths, yet humility compels me to acknowledge that I may be mapping the contours of my own cultural moment and mistaking them for eternal verities. And then there is time itself as a limitation. Some symptoms have such deep roots, such elaborate defensive structures built around them, that the work of analysis might require not months or even years, but decades. How many people possess that kind of patience, that depth of commitment? Life is short. Patients grow weary. They want relief now, not in some indefinite future after we have excavated every layer of their psychological archaeology. And this is where I have made adjustments, not compromises. Mind you, adjustments. There is a difference. A compromise suggests we abandon truth for convenience. An adjustment recognizes that truth itself has textures, gradations, and that the therapeutic encounter must be calibrated to the individual soul before us. I began to develop what some have called the brief psychoanalytic therapy, though I dislike that term. It sounds like something packaged for sale, like canned soup at the grocer's. What I actually did was learn to listen more strategically, to identify the central conflict more rapidly, and to direct my interpretations toward that nucleus rather than wandering through every adjacent territory. Think of it this way. If a man comes to me with crippling anxiety about his career, and through our initial conversations I discover this anxiety stems from his father's relentless criticism during childhood, I do not then need to explore his toilet training, his relationship with his siblings, and his adolescent fantasies about the neighbor's daughter. Those may all be interesting. They may all connect to the larger tapestry. But if I can help him see how he has internalized his father's voice, how he now criticizes himself with the same merciless judgment, and how this internal persecutor prevents him from taking necessary risks, well, we have done something meaningful. We have touched the live wire. This is the art of psychoanalysis that I wish more of my followers would embrace. The ability to distinguish between what is essential and what is merely interesting. Yes, the human psyche is infinitely complex. Yes, every detail potentially matters. But in the room with an actual suffering person, we must make choices about where to focus our attention. Some of my colleagues treat psychoanalysis like an academic exercise, as if completeness were the goal. They remind me of those medieval scholars who debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Fascinating, perhaps. Utterly useless to anyone actually troubled by angels. The patient does not care about the comprehensiveness of our theories. The patient cares about waking up without dread, about being able to love without terror, about sleeping through the night without nightmares, about looking in the mirror and recognizing the person staring back. So I have learned to be more directive, more focused. I still listen for the unconscious material that never changes, but I listen with a specific question in mind. What is the central conflict paralyzing this person? What childhood wound continues to bleed into their present life, and how quickly can I help them see the connection? This approach has made me unpopular in certain psychoanalytic circles. They accuse me of being superficial, of abandoning the depth psychology I pioneered. They say I have grown impatient in my old age, that I want results too quickly. Perhaps they are right about my impatience. I am an old man now. I have seen too many patients suffer unnecessarily because their analysts were more interested in proving their theories than in relieving actual pain. I have watched brilliant clinicians become lost in the labyrinth of their own interpretations, forgetting that the point of entering the labyrinth was to find a way out. And yes, I have grown skeptical of my own tendency toward grandiosity, toward wanting to explain everything. It is an occupational hazard of being Sigmund Freud. Everyone expects me to have an answer for everything, to reduce all human experience to a few elegant principles, but some things resist explanation. Some pain is simply pain, not a symbol of something else. This is perhaps the hardest lesson I have learned. Sometimes the goal is not to interpret, but simply to accompany. To sit with someone in their suffering without immediately trying to translate it into our theoretical language. I think of a woman who lost her child. She came to me not long after it happened, and I sat across from her in my consulting room as she wept. Every instinct in my training told me to look for the underlying mechanism, to understand the psychic economy of her grief, to trace how her loss connected to earlier losses, perhaps even to her own childhood separation anxieties. But as I listened to her, really listened, I realized something that shook the foundation of my own certainty. Her grief was not complicated. It was not symbolic. It was exactly what it appeared to be. The unbearable pain of a mother who would never again hold her child. In that moment, my theories felt almost obscene. They felt like an intrusion, a way of protecting myself from the rawness of her suffering by wrapping it in intellectual distance. So instead, I simply sat with her. I let her cry. I acknowledged the unspeakable horror of what she was experiencing without trying to explain it, contextualize it, or find some hidden meaning that would make it more bearable. And you know what? That was more therapeutic than any interpretation I could have offered. Because sometimes what people need is not insight, they need witness. They need someone to confirm that yes, this is as terrible as it feels. And no, there is no deeper meaning that will make it hurt less. This realization has been humbling in ways I never anticipated. I built my entire career on the premise that beneath every symptom lies a hidden truth, that if we dig deep enough, we can unearth the secret meaning that will set us free. And while this remains true in many cases, I now understand it is not universally true. Some suffering simply is. Some pain is irreducible. The danger of my method, and I say this with full awareness of its implications, is that it can become a defense mechanism for the analyst. We hide behind our interpretations, our theories, our clever readings of symbols and dreams. We translate human suffering into our professional vocabulary because it makes us feel competent, in control, useful. But this can distance us from the actual human being sitting across from us, bleeding out their soul in real time. I have learned to recognize when I am interpreting because the interpretation serves the patient, and when I am interpreting because it serves my own need to feel like I understand, like I have mastered the chaos of human existence through my theoretical framework. The former is healing, the latter is a subtle form of violence. And let me be clear, this does not mean abandoning psychoanalysis or declaring that interpretation has no value. It means holding our methods more lightly, more humbly. It means remembering that our theories are maps, not territories. The map can be extraordinarily useful. It can help us navigate terrain that would otherwise be hopelessly confusing. But we must never confuse the map for the actual landscape, the theoretical construct for the lived reality of another human being. I think about how many of my colleagues have taken my ideas and turned them into rigid dogma, into a kind of secular religion where every deviation from orthodoxy is treated as heresy. They clutch their copies of the interpretation of dreams like holy scripture, as if I handed down these ideas from some mountain carved in stone. This horrifies me. I am a scientist, not a prophet. My work is meant to be questioned, refined, and yes, even discarded when better explanations emerge. And yet, I understand the temptation. When people are drowning in confusion, when the modern world strips them of certainty and tradition, they reach for anything that promises solid ground. My theories became that ground for some, but this is precisely the danger, not that people believe in my ideas, but that they times stop thinking times because of them. I'll tell you what truly troubles me most. I discovered the unconscious, yes. I showed the world that beneath our rational surface lies a churning sea of desires, conflicts, and forgotten traumas. This was revolutionary. But some followers transformed this discovery into a kind of mysticism, as if the unconscious were some magical realm where all answers dwell, requiring only the right priest, the right analyst to interpret its mysteries. No, no, no. The unconscious is not mystical. It is simply time's unknown asterisk. It's the part of our mental life we cannot directly access, the mechanisms that operate behind the curtain. Understanding it requires painstaking work, careful observation, constant revision of our hypotheses. It's messy, uncertain, often frustrating work. There's nothing spiritual about it. I think of Jung sometimes, my brilliant protege, who became obsessed with archetypes and collective unconscious and all manner of metaphysical speculation. We parted ways bitterly, and I won't pretend it didn't wound me. But the fundamental disagreement was this. He wanted to make the unconscious times cosmic asterisk, asterisk universal asterisk, asterisk eternal asterisk. He wanted to fill it with gods and heroes and primordial symbols. I wanted to keep it grounded in individual experience, in the particular history of each human being, in the observable mechanisms of mental life. Who was right? I don't know. Perhaps we both captured different aspects of psychological truth. Perhaps his approach helped some people mine never could. But I know this. The moment you declare something sacred and beyond questioning, you've abandoned science. You've created religion. And there are already enough religions in the world, they don't need my name attached to another one. The irony cuts deep. I spent my life analyzing religion, showing how it emerges from psychological needs, from our childhood helplessness, from our terror of death and meaninglessness. I called it an illusion, not necessarily false, mind you, but an idea we embrace because we times need it to be true, not because evidence compels us. And now some treat psychoanalysis itself as religion, embracing it because they need it to be true, blind to evidence that might suggest otherwise. This is humanity's tragedy, perhaps. We cannot seem to hold uncertainty without eventually crystallizing it into certainty. We cannot remain comfortable with questions that have no final answers. We need our priests, our prophets, our sacred texts, even when the prophet himself is screaming, "Don't listen to me that way." You see, there's a particular kind of suffering in being misunderstood by your own followers. Your critics, your enemies, they can be dismissed, argued with, fought against. But your followers? They love you. They praise you. They build institutions in your name. How do you fight that? How do you tell people who have found comfort in your ideas that they're using them wrong? You sound ungrateful, petulant, like a man who cannot accept his own success. But success without accuracy is failure. Fame without truth is hollow. I would trade every psychoanalytic institute, every journal, every chapter devoted to interpreting my work for one simple thing: genuine intellectual freedom within the field I founded. The freedom to say, Freud was wrong about this, without being excommunicated. The freedom to test ideas against evidence without being accused of betraying the cause. The freedom to evolve beyond me. That's what I wanted to create. Not a monument, but a method. Not a doctrine, but a doorway. And perhaps that's why I never feared being wrong about certain things. Because the truth I was after wasn't meant to be final, it was meant to be functional. A tool that helps you dig, not a wall that stops you from digging further. I remember a letter I received from a patient years after our work together had ended. She wrote, "You didn't cure me, Dr. Freud. You taught me how to be curious about my own suffering." That line stayed with me, because that's it, isn't it? That's the whole endeavor in a single sentence. We're not here to eliminate the darkness. We're here to stop being terrified of it. To walk into it with a lantern and say, "All right, let's see what you're made of." And what we find in that darkness is rarely what we expect. Sometimes it's rage we didn't know we were allowed to feel. Sometimes it's grief we never finished processing. Sometimes it's desire we were taught to be ashamed of. But whatever it is, it's ours. And reclaiming it, naming it, changes everything. I've seen people transform not by becoming someone new, but by finally becoming who they already were beneath the layers of performance and pretense. The man who stops pretending he's fine and admits he's been lonely for decades. The woman who stops blaming herself for her mother's coldness and recognizes she was always enough. The person who finally says, "I don't have to keep carrying this." That's the gift of the unconscious. Not that it holds secrets, but that it holds truths we couldn't afford to acknowledge until we were strong enough to face them. And facing them doesn't mean they disappear. It means they stop controlling us from the shadows. You know, people often ask me if I believe in happiness, as if psychoanalysis is some pessimistic endeavor that denies joy or fulfillment. And my answer is always the same. I don't believe in happiness as a permanent state. I believe in aliveness. I believe in the capacity to feel the full range of what it means to be human: grief and gratitude, desire and disappointment, love and loss. The goal isn't to feel good all the time. The goal is to feel real, to stop numbing, to stop performing, to stop running. Because when you stop running from yourself, something remarkable happens. You start to recognize your own patterns. You start to see the script you've been following without realizing it, and once you see the script, you can begin to rewrite it. That's agency. That's freedom. Not the absence of conflict, but the ability to meet conflict with awareness, instead of reaction. I think about the patients who came to me with symptoms they couldn't explain: paralysis with no physical cause, anxiety with no clear trigger, compulsions that made no logical sense. And what we discovered time and time again was that the body was speaking what the mind couldn't yet say. The symptom was a message written in a language we'd forgotten how to read, and when we finally translated that message, when we gave words to what had been wordless, the symptom often lost its grip, not because we'd defeated it, but because we'd understood it, because we'd listened. That's what I mean when I say psychoanalysis is an act of profound respect for the psyche. We're not trying to silence it or suppress it, we're trying to hear it, to honor what it's been trying to tell us all along. And sometimes what it's been trying to tell us is painful, that we weren't loved the way we needed, that we were betrayed, that we lost something we can never get back. But naming that pain, letting it be seen and felt, is how we stop letting it dictate our lives from the darkness. Because once you name the pain, you can ask a different question. Not what's wrong with me, but what happened to me. And that reframing changes everything. It shifts you from shame to understanding, from self-attack to self-compassion. You see, for years you've been running the wrong diagnostic. You've been trying to fix a character flaw that never existed. But the truth is, you're not broken. You're adapted. Your psyche did exactly what it needed to do to survive an impossible situation. Your nervous system learned to protect you in the only ways it knew how. And now, as an adult, those same protective mechanisms feel like prisons, not because they failed, but because they succeeded so well that they became your default mode. Let me paint this more clearly. Imagine a child learning that speaking up leads to punishment. That child learns to go quiet, to disappear, to make themselves small. It works. They avoid the punishment. The behavior is reinforced. Fast forward 20 years, and that same person sits in a meeting with a brilliant idea but can't speak. They watch someone else get the credit. They berate themselves for being weak or passive. But they're not weak, they're still following the algorithm that kept them safe when they had no other options. Or consider the child who learns that their emotions upset the adults around them. They discover that shutting down, becoming numb, is the path of least resistance. It works. The adults are happier. The household is calmer. Decades later, that person sits across from a partner who's begging for emotional connection, and they feel absolutely nothing. Not because they're cold or defective, but because the circuit that allowed them to feel freely was severed as an act of survival. This is what I mean when I say your symptoms are solutions. They're outdated solutions. Yes, operating systems that haven't been updated since childhood, but they were brilliant adaptations in their time. The problem is that your psyche doesn't know the war is over. It's still in the trenches, still firing the same defensive maneuvers, even though the enemy has long since left the field. And here's where the real work begins. Because if your symptoms are solutions, then healing isn't about willpower or positive thinking or forcing yourself to just get over it. Healing is about updating the system. It's about teaching your psyche that the old rules no longer apply, that it's safe now to be visible, safe to feel, safe to need, safe to fail. But let me be brutally honest, this updating process is not comfortable. Your psyche doesn't want to let go of strategies that kept you alive. There's a part of you that will fight every step of this transformation because, from its perspective, change equals danger. The familiar pain feels safer than the unknown freedom. This is why people stay in toxic relationships, why they sabotage success right before achieving it, why they return again and again to the same self-destructive patterns. The resistance isn't weakness. It's the psyche's loyalty to the child you once were, the child who needed those defenses to survive. And we cannot simply override that loyalty with logic. We have to honor it, thank it even, while gently showing it evidence that the world has changed. This is why therapeutic work is so delicate, so slow. We are negotiating with a part of the mind that still believes it is living in the past. The unconscious does not know that you are 37, not 7. It does not recognize that you have resources now that you lacked as a child: autonomy, language, the ability to leave dangerous situations. It still operates as if every criticism from a colleague is your father's rage, as if every romantic rejection is your mother's abandonment. I once worked with a man who could not stay in romantic relationships longer than 3 months. Always, he would find a reason to leave some flaw in his partner, some unbearable trait that made continuation impossible. He came to me convinced he was simply discerning, that he had high standards. But as we explored his history, we discovered something far more painful. His mother had died when he was 3 months old. 3 months. And his psyche had encoded a simple, brutal equation. Asterisk attachment equals loss asterisk. His unconscious was ending relationships at precisely the moment his internal alarm began screaming times danger asterisk. He was leaving before he could be left. The defense was brilliant in its logic. If you abandon first, you control the pain. But it was also imprisoning him in eternal solitude. We worked for months simply helping him times this pattern. Not to judge it, not to shame himself for it, but to observe it with curiosity. Ah, there it is again, that familiar panic at 3 months. Hello, old friend. I see you trying to protect me. This stance of compassionate observation is crucial. We cannot bully the unconscious into change. We can only befriend it, and slowly, painstakingly, he learned to stay, to feel the panic, and not immediately act on it. To recognize that the terror he felt was real, but times old, times it belonged to a 3-month-old child, not to the grown man he had become. He learned to say to his partners, I am feeling an irrational urge to run. It has nothing to do with you and everything to do with my history. Can we sit with this together? And in that vulnerability, he found something his unconscious had never predicted. Safety. Connection. The evidence that this time, the story could end differently. This is what I mean when I say the defenses must be honored before they can be released. We do not storm the fortress. We send envoys. We negotiate. We show the frightened guard at the gate that the war is over, that it is safe now to lay down arms. Consider the person who deflects every compliment, who cannot accept praise without immediately diminishing it or turning it into a joke. On the surface, this seems like simple modesty. But dig deeper and you often find something more complex. A childhood in which being noticed meant being criticized, where standing out invited punishment. The unconscious learned, asterisk visibility is dangerous asterisk, and so it developed a reflex, deflect, diminish, disappear. Even now, when someone offers genuine appreciation, the ancient alarm sounds, asterisk, get small, get invisible. It's not safe to be seen. Asterisk. The person carrying this defense will tell you they are merely humble. They do not recognize the cost, the promotions not pursued, the relationships kept shallow, the life half lived in the shadows. They do not see that their humility is actually a prison, a way of staying small to stay safe. But here is where the work becomes truly fascinating. When we begin to trace this pattern back to its origin, when we uncover the childhood logic that created it, something remarkable happens. The person begins to see the defense not as times who they are times, but as times what they learned asterisk. And in that distinction lies the possibility of freedom. I am not inherently someone who must shrink. I am someone who learned to shrink to survive a particular environment, and that environment no longer exists. This realization, this separation of self from survival strategy is the beginning of liberation. What happens next is both predictable and extraordinary. You begin to notice the countless moments throughout your day when you make yourself smaller without conscious thought. You're in a meeting, and you feel an insight forming, something valuable to contribute. But you watch yourself, and this watching is new. You watch yourself perform the familiar dance, the slight hesitation, the internal negotiation, the eventual silence. Except now, you recognize it. You see the machinery of your own diminishment in operation. And recognition, I must tell you, is the first instrument of change. You begin to conduct small experiments. Not grand gestures, that's not how genuine transformation works, but quiet rebellions. You speak your preference when asked where to eat dinner instead of your automatic, I don't mind, whatever you prefer. Such a small thing, yes? But you notice the tremor of anxiety that accompanies it. That tremor tells you everything. It measures the distance between who you learn to be and who you might become. Some people in your life will respond with confusion. They've grown accustomed to a particular version of you, one that accommodates, that yields, that manages their comfort at the expense of your own. When you begin to occupy more space, they experience it as an imposition. You've changed, they might say, and they don't intend it as a compliment. They're correct, of course, but what they're really expressing is their discomfort with a shift in the equilibrium you've maintained. You were performing a function in their psychological economy, and you've suddenly resigned from that position. This is the moment when many people retreat. The guilt becomes overwhelming. They think, perhaps I was being selfish. Perhaps my smallness was actually consideration. Perhaps I should return to who I was. But this is precisely where you must hold steady, because what you're experiencing isn't evidence that you've done something wrong. It's evidence that your survival strategy was working. It was maintaining relationships, yes, but at what cost? The cost was you. Here's what I've observed. The people who genuinely care for you, who see you as more than a function they need performed, they will adjust. There will be a period of recalibration, certainly. They will need to learn a new dance with you. But they will be curious rather than defensive. They will ask questions rather than issue accusations. They will grow with you rather than insist you remain static for their convenience. The others, they will resist. They will employ every tool they know, guilt, anger, withdrawal, subtle punishments to restore you to your former shape. And this tells you something valuable. It reveals that their connection to you was always conditional. Conditional on your smallness, conditional on your compliance, conditional on you never asking them to stretch or accommodate or consider your needs with the same weight they've given their own. This is painful knowledge, but it's necessary knowledge. You begin to understand that taking up space isn't about becoming loud or aggressive or domineering. Those are different patterns, different wounds. Taking up space, genuine space, is about existing without apology. It's about believing that your thoughts, your feelings, your preferences, your presence, that these things have intrinsic worth, not because you've earned them through perfect behavior or ceaseless accommodation, but because you exist. You see, in my years of practice, I encountered countless individuals who had shrunk themselves to such a degree that they barely recognized their own silhouette anymore. They had become what I might call psychological chameleons, constantly adapting their colors to match whatever background others required of them. And the tragedy, the profound tragedy, was that they believed this camouflage was virtue. They had confused self-erasure with morality. But let me be clear about something crucial. Taking up space does not mean becoming a tyrant. It does not mean trampling over others or demanding that the world revolve around your whims. That would simply be replacing one neurosis with another, trading pathological accommodation for pathological narcissism. No, what I'm describing is something far more nuanced, far more balanced. Think of it this way. Imagine a dinner table where everyone has a plate. Taking up space means allowing yourself to eat from your own plate without guilt, without constantly glancing around to ensure everyone else has finished theirs first. It means not offering your meal to others before you've taken a single bite, not convincing yourself that you're somehow less hungry, less deserving of nourishment. The people pleaser approaches the table differently. They arrive last, they take the smallest portions, they spend the entire meal monitoring everyone else's satisfaction level. Is your food warm enough? Would you like some of mine? Are you sure you have enough? Meanwhile, their own plate grows cold, untouched, because the simple act of feeding themselves feels impossibly selfish. This metaphor extends far beyond literal meals, of course. It applies to conversational space. Do you allow yourself to speak, to share your stories, or do you always position yourself as the audience? It applies to emotional space. Do you acknowledge your own feelings, or do you immediately subordinate them to whatever others are experiencing? It applies to physical space. Do you sit comfortably, expansively, or do you contract yourself into the smallest possible configuration, as if apologizing for your very atoms? I had a patient once who described feeling like she was constantly holding her breath in the presence of others. Not literally, she clarified, but psychologically, as if existing fully, breathing deeply, would somehow consume oxygen that rightfully belonged to someone else. She would enter a room and immediately begin the complex calculations of accommodation. Where should she sit to cause the least disruption? What should she say to ensure maximum approval with minimum offense? How could she arrange her very presence to be as unobtrusive as possible? The exhaustion she described was total. Because you cannot hold your breath forever, eventually something ruptures. Either you explode in resentment, gasping desperately for air, or you quietly suffocate, disappearing into a fog of self-abandonment so complete that you lose track of where you end and others begin. This is what happens when we confuse boundaries with walls, when we mistake assertion for aggression, when we believe that our worth must be perpetually negotiated rather than inherently recognized. Now, let me show you something that might disturb the comfortable narratives you've been telling yourself. The person who cannot say no is often simultaneously the person who quietly resents every yes they've ever given. This is the paradox at the heart of the pathological people-pleaser. You accumulate resentment like interest on a debt you never agreed to take on. And then you're bewildered when bitterness corrodes your relationships from the inside. You smile while serving, and then you lie awake at night cataloguing every unreturned favor, every unacknowledged sacrifice, every asymmetry in the emotional economy of your relationships. The ledger grows, the resentment compounds, and still you cannot bring yourself to speak the simple truth. I cannot do this. I do not want to. This chronic self-silencing does something insidious to your perception of others. You begin to see manipulation everywhere because you yourself are constantly manipulating, suppressing your authentic responses, performing an acceptable version of yourself, strategically managing others' perceptions. You project your own lack of directness onto everyone around you. When someone makes a request, you don't hear it as a simple question that might receive a simple answer. You hear it as a demand, a trap, a test of your worthiness. And because you cannot conceive of refusing without elaborate justification, you assume others will react to your boundaries with the same disproportionate wounded outrage that you would feel if someone refused you. Let me be devastatingly clear about what's actually happening here. You're not protecting others from disappointment. You're protecting yourself from the imagined catastrophe of their disapproval. You're not being kind, you're being cowardly. And I don't use that word to shame you, but to illuminate the mechanism. Courage, genuine courage, requires the willingness to tolerate others' negative emotions without attempting to manage or fix them. It requires the radical acceptance that you cannot control how someone receives your truth, only whether you speak it. When you reflexively say yes to avoid a moment of discomfort, you're choosing the certain suffering of self-betrayal over the possible suffering of someone's passing disappointment. And here's what your people-pleasing has cost you that you haven't yet calculated: authenticity in your relationships. Every inauthentic yes builds a wall between you and genuine connection. Because the person others are responding to isn't actually you, it's a carefully constructed avatar designed to minimize conflict and maximize approval. You believe you're fostering closeness through accommodation, but you're actually creating distance through dishonesty. The relationships you're so desperately trying to preserve through your compliance are built on a foundation of systematic self-erasure. They love the version of you that always agrees, always accommodates, always yields. They don't love you because you've never allowed them to meet you. Consider how this manifests in your intimate relationships. Your partner asks what you want for dinner, and you say, anything is fine when you have a clear preference. They choose something you don't particularly enjoy, and you eat it with a smile that doesn't reach your eyes. This happens again and again in 1,000 small interactions. Where do you want to go? What do you want to watch? How do you feel about this decision? And every time, you defer, deflect, diminish your own presence. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. It's not worth the conflict. You're being flexible and easygoing. But your partner never gets to know you. They're in relationship with a mirror that only reflects their own preferences back to them. And when the relationship eventually collapses under the weight of this accumulated inauthenticity, you'll wonder why they couldn't see the real you, never acknowledging that you never showed them. This pattern extends beyond romantic relationships, of course. You see it in friendships where you're perpetually afraid of being too much, so you edit yourself down, never quite present, never quite absent, hovering in this exhausting middle ground where connection can't really take root. You see it in professional settings where you're so concerned with managing impressions that you never develop genuine mentorship or authentic collaboration. You're always performing competence, never admitting uncertainty, never asking the questions that might reveal you don't know everything. And here's what fascinates me most about this defense mechanism. It creates the very abandonment it seeks to prevent, just through a different pathway. The authentic self doesn't fear abandonment, it fears annihilation. Being rejected for who you actually are feels like a negation of your entire existence. So you construct this elaborate system where you can be rejected repeatedly without ever really being touched by it. They didn't reject me, you tell yourself. They rejected this version I showed them. The real me is still safe, still untested, still theoretically lovable. It's a brilliant solution in its own terrible way. You've created a buffer zone between your core self and the world's judgment. But you've also created a prison, because now you're living with this constant awareness that you're fundamentally unknowable, that no validation you receive actually counts because it wasn't directed at the real you. Every compliment lands hollow. Every expression of love feels conditional. Every friendship feels like it's one authentic revelation away from dissolving. I've watched this destroy people slowly, this chronic sense of fraudulence. They accumulate achievements, relationships, status, all the external markers of a successful life, and still feel fundamentally alone because they've never let anyone close enough to actually see them. They're surrounded by people and still isolated, loved by many and still convinced they're unlovable. The defense has worked too well. It's protected them from rejection so effectively that it's also protected them from genuine connection. And the tragedy compounds when you realize how exhausting this is to maintain. The cognitive load of constantly monitoring and adjusting your presentation, of tracking who knows what about you, of maintaining different versions of yourself for different contexts, it's immense. You're running multiple operating systems simultaneously, and the processing power it requires leaves you depleted for everything else. You wonder why you're always tired, why nothing feels effortless, why you can't just relax. It's because you're not living one life, you're living several simultaneously, each one slightly different, each one requiring its maintenance and attention. The path out of this pattern requires something that will initially feel more dangerous than the pattern itself: strategic vulnerability. Notice, I don't say radical honesty or complete transparency. Those can become their own forms of defense, overwhelming people with disclosure as a way to control how they perceive you. I mean the deliberate practice of revealing something authentic, something that matters, something that carries actual risk, and then staying present with whatever response emerges. Start small. With someone who has demonstrated trustworthiness, share something you've been editing out. Not your deepest trauma as a test of whether they can handle you, that's still manipulation, but something real, a preference you've been hiding, an opinion you've been softening, an emotion you've been managing. And then, this is the crucial part, don't explain it away. Don't immediately qualify it or contextualize it, or give them 17 reasons why you think that way. Just let it exist between you. The silence that follows is not empty, it's full of everything you've just given them permission to see. Your actual complexity, your real interior landscape, the parts of you that don't fit neatly into social scripts. Most people will instinctively try to fill that silence with reassurance. "Oh, that's not weird," or "I totally get that." Watch what happens if you simply smile and say, "Yeah, it's strange, isn't it?" You're not asking them to fix your strangeness, you're inviting them to sit with it, to be curious about it rather than rushing to categorize it. This is what builds genuine intimacy, not the sharing of polished, pre-approved vulnerabilities, but the willingness to exist undefended in front of another person, to show them the odd angles and contradictions that make you specifically you. I've watched this transform relationships that had become stale through years of conversational routine. Two people who thought they knew everything about each other suddenly discovering entire territories they'd never mapped. Not because those territories were hidden, but because they'd never been invited to explore them without immediately explaining them away. The thing that surprises people most when they start doing this, it's not that others reject their strangeness, it's that sharing strangeness gives everyone else permission to be strange too. Your friend mentions something they've never told anyone because your honesty created a space where unpolished truth feels welcome. Your partner shares a thought they'd been afraid was too odd. Your colleague drops their professional mask just a fraction. You become the person in the room who makes it safe to be real. Not through any grand gesture, but through the simple act of not editing yourself into something more palatable. And here's what happens to you in the process: you stop being exhausted by your own life. That constant low-level fatigue from maintaining a slightly artificial version of yourself, it dissolves. You have more energy because you're not burning it all on impression management. You become more confident, but in a completely different way than you expected. Not the confidence of having everything figured out, the confidence of being okay with not having everything figured out, of knowing that your uncertainties and contradictions don't make you defective, they make you dimensional. People often ask me if there are contexts where you shouldn't do this, where the strategic mask is actually necessary. And yes, of course there are situations that call for professional boundaries, contexts where vulnerability would be exploited rather than met. I'm not suggesting you bare your soul to your auditor or turn job interviews into therapy sessions, but the number of situations where authentic strangeness is actually risky, much smaller than most of us assume. We've been taught to see danger everywhere, to believe that showing our real thoughts is constantly on the verge of getting us rejected, fired, ostracized. The truth is far more mundane and far more liberating. Most people are too worried about their own strangeness to spend much energy judging yours. And the ones who do judge harshly, they're usually the most terrified of their own interior oddness, the most rigidly controlled. Their judgment tells you more about their fear than about your worth. So this is my invitation as we close. Start small. Pick one conversation this week. just one. And when you feel yourself reaching for the diplomatic response, the strategic answer, the version of your thought that's been focus grouped for maximum acceptability, pause, take a breath, and say the real thing instead. Not the cruel thing, not the unfiltered id screaming into the void. The real thing, the thought you're actually thinking, expressed with honesty but not with weaponry. Notice what happens. Notice how it feels in your body to speak without the invisible editor running. Notice how the other person responds when they're met with something genuine instead of something performed. And then do it again and again, until the authentic voice isn't the exception you make when you're feeling brave, it's simply how you move through the world. Because at the end of your life, you won't remember the conversations where you said what you were supposed to say. You'll remember the moments when you were actually there, actually present, actually yourself. That's the gift. That's what makes you magnetic without even trying. You see, my friends, there is something I must confess to you before we part ways today. Something I have observed in 30 years of clinical practice. Something that haunts me still when I walk through the streets of Vienna and watch people hurrying past one another like strangers in a nightmare. Most people never discover this truth. They live their entire lives, 70, 80 years on this earth, and they die without ever knowing who they actually were. They wear masks so long the masks fuse to their skin. They perform roles so consistently they forget they are performing. I have sat across from men in their 60s who suddenly begin to weep not from sadness, but from recognition. Dr. Freud, they say to me, I have just realized I have never made a single decision that was truly my own. 40 years of marriage to a woman they didn't love. A career in their father's business they despised. Children raised according to their mother's instructions. A personality carefully constructed to meet everyone's expectations but their own. This is the tragedy I see repeated again and again. And I tell you with absolute certainty, it doesn't have to be yours. The work we've discussed today, this excavation of your authentic self, this is not selfish. Let me be crystal clear about this because I know how the voice of social conditioning whispers in your ear. Who do you think you are? Why should you get to be yourself when the rest of us are suffering? What makes you so special? That voice is the internalized authority of every person who needed you to be smaller so they could feel larger. And it is lying to you. When you become yourself, you don't diminish others. You give them permission. You become living proof that it's possible. I have seen this happen. One person in a family breaks free from the pattern, and suddenly 3 others find the courage to question their own chains. Your authenticity is not a luxury. It is not an indulgence. It is oxygen. And just as you cannot breathe for someone else, you cannot live someone else's life without suffocating. So here is what I want you to do when you leave this conversation. Not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, but today, right now. I want you to identify one small way you have been performing instead of being. One tiny mask you can remove. Maybe you laugh at jokes you don't find funny. Maybe you nod along with opinions you don't share. Maybe you dress in a way that feels like a costume. Maybe you use words that aren't really yours, borrowed vocabulary from people you're trying to impress. Choose one. Just one. And stop doing it. The world will not end. I promise you this. In fact, you may discover something remarkable the people worth keeping in your life will barely notice, because they loved you anyway. And the people who react with horror at your authenticity, they were never really seeing you in the first place. They were seeing a mirror of their own fears and needs. This is how transformation begins. Not with grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but with small acts of honesty. One true word where there would have been a polite lie. One authentic reaction where there would have been a calculated response. One moment of genuine presence where there would have been performance. And gradually, so gradually you barely notice. You become fluent in the language of your own soul. You start to recognize the feeling of being yourself, the way you recognize hunger or thirst. And once you know that feeling, once you taste it, you cannot go back to the performance. It becomes unbearable. This is my wish for you. Not happiness. Happiness is too simple, too fleeting. My wish is that you become so completely yourself that the question of performance never even occurs to you, that you live with such authenticity that pretense feels like wearing someone else's ill-fitting clothes. Because that, my dear friends, is when you finally arrive at something deeper than happiness. You arrive at peace. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances or validation or applause. The peace of knowing that whatever happens, you were here, you were real, you were yourself. And that is enough. More than enough. It is everything.